I'm Amanda Walker and you're watching IMF Today, live from the annual meetings here in Washington, D.C. Let's take a look at what's coming up today.
We start this week of the annual meetings together. It is the first time in 3 years when the annual meetings will be in person.
I feel lots of energy from the World Bank, from the IMF staff in terms of tackling the problems.
Civil society is such an important voice for us here at the IMF.
Specifically, what is the IMF doing to support countries given the food crisis exacerbated by the Russia-Ukraine war?
So what is your message to leaders this week on what we need to do to end this crisis and prevent the next one?
Fossil fuels are a bridge to nowhere, or maybe they are a bridge to somewhere worse than what the African continent is already experiencing as a result of the climate crisis.
Hello and a warm welcome from IMF headquarters, where central bankers, finance ministers and global thought leaders from 190 member countries will meet for the first time since the pandemic struck in 2020. I'm Amanda Walker and this is IMF Today. There's a huge amount happening inside these buildings over the next week. And while you can't be everywhere, we can. So for the next 5 days, we'll be broadcasting live at 5 p.m. DC time to give you the headlines from the annual meetings. We'll have all the important developments and the big issues that matter, as well as analysis from some of the most influential decision makers from around the globe. Now, the world faces shock after shock after shock. COVID, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, climate change, the burning issues Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva focused on in her curtain raiser speech, and which are sure to dominate many of the discussions this week. And those discussions began this morning in a conversation with World Bank Group President David Malpass.
Over these last 3 years, we lived through unthinkable events that are having significant consequences. COVID, still with us, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, dramatic consequences everywhere, climate disasters on all continents, and all of this has driven people into a very difficult place. They're exhausted and they have to cope with the cost of living crisis. I actually am heartbroken to see the world again witnessing increasing poverty, increasing hunger and malnutrition. At the IMF, we are, I call it the third line of defense. We want to see humanitarian assistance grants. We want to see the World Bank, as you are doing it, be out there. But we are also making funding available for balance of payment needs. We have created a food shock window, so countries that are affected either because they cannot export their food, like Ukraine, or because they cannot import food, like many countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, can
this
benefit.
This is food and fertilizer and energy, so it's all hitting the fiscal space.
At the same time.
Any estimates of how much?
For the, we are looking at the estimates of the impact. We took specifically to heart the issue of food. Why? Because you die when food is not available. This is not a trivial question. And we identified about $9 billion shortfall in terms of balance of payment coverage for this only.
So, day one kicked off with focus on the Youth Fellowship Programme. Civil society organisations, that's non-profits, think tanks, also met for a town hall. And we have the first of 12 analytical corners, which are basically deep dives on all the research IMF economists have been doing throughout the year. Then a big theme that will feature heavily throughout this week, climate change, introduced by climate activist Vanessa Nakate.
I would ask leaders who are gathering here for three things. First, I would ask all leaders to put people at the heart of all decisions about the energy and the climate crisis. You must make decisions that truly help safeguard the lives of vulnerable people, not stuff even more money into the pockets of the rich. I remember being in a meeting of indigenous leaders a few months back, and there is one thing I learned from them. They say that whenever they wanted to make a decision in the community, they sat and asked themselves, will this decision impact the children negatively or positively? And the moment they realized that there was a room for any negative impact, that decision would be immediately cancelled and another decision would be thought about. So that is the first thing I want. Whatever decision that you make, is it good for the children or not? Then second, I would like to ask the World Bank and multilateral development banks to use this moment to end finance for all new fossil fuel development and double down on finance for renewable energy in Africa and across the global south. And that finance must come in the form of grants, not loans, which only add more debt to already existing debt. And thirdly, I would like to ask the finance ministers to call for loss and damage to be put on the format agenda at COP27.
Vanessa Nakate there, voicing one of the big talking points this week. Now, climate change is one of the many challenges facing the next generation, which was the focus this morning when IMF Deputy Managing Director Antoinette Saye hosted a conversation on the fund's Youth Fellowship Programme. Now, one of the IMF's youth fellows is Lele Balde. She's also on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list and campaigns for better financial inclusion. First of all, Lele, tell us, what is financial inclusion?
Thank you for having me, Amanda. Financial inclusion is a state whereby individuals and businesses have access to financial services in a way that's accessible and affordable to them. So what I mean by financial services is credits, access to savings, and insurance. Everyday people like you and I might take that for granted, but for the majority of people in developing countries, they don't have access to financial inclusion at all, which causes a huge economic problem for developing countries.
Which probably answers my next question. Why do you feel that it's important for you to be here?
Thank you. So as a youth fellow for the IMF and as a young person, as you mentioned, under 30, we need to have a voice at the global level. We need to be involved in these conversations, especially because the youth represents the future. We're the future leaders of today. The people who are talking here today, in a couple of years, 10 to 15 years, this will be us. So we need to have a seat at the table and talk about possible solutions to development problems that we're solving. So that's why I'm here today, to advocate for that.
Who will you be targeting this week? Who do you want to get the ear of? Who do you want to make sure hears your message?
So I want to get the ears of policymakers. As you mentioned, we have 190 countries represented here. I find that with these annual meetings that happen, there's a lot of talk, but I think we need to move from talk to action. And as a financial inclusion advocate, I'm here to meet the leaders, the stakeholders, and the people that implement the policies that affect young people all over the world.
And just tell me how it will work for you, because, you know, obviously people are watching, haven't necessarily attended one of these meetings. What will you be physically doing over the next few days?
Absolutely. It can be very intimidating to come to the IMF meetings, all the buildings, all the people, but essentially I'm here to be a voice for the youth. So attend the meetings, participate, have my voice be heard, advocate for not just myself, but other youth all around the world, and let people understand that our voice matters and that we need to be a part of the conversation and we need a seat at the table.
We saw Vanessa Nakate there. Do you feel that things are changing in terms of that representation?
Absolutely. I think there's an effort being made worldwide to include the youth, but I think that it could be a greater effort. Vanessa has done a fantastic job of advocating for financial and economic as well as climate change, all over the world. But we need more Vanessas. We need more people like me and her that are young and that are speaking their truth to power and ensuring that we're being heard by those that make the decisions that affect us.
And just finally, what will make you happy when you're on the plane heading back home in terms of what you've achieved this week?
For me, I really want to be able to have my voice heard. It makes me sad that in this day and age, majority of people are financially excluded. I think of my father's village in Kolda, which is a town in Senegal, where people don't have access to electricity, which causes so many issues in the sense that children are not able to be educated. They can't study it, after the sun goes down, which causes so many issues, in terms of economic inclusion, financial inclusion. It's really the basis of it all. So for me, I want to ensure that my voice is heard. The sub-Saharan African continent contains 70% of the youth population. So we have 743 million young people in Africa, and by the year 2050, we will be much more than that. So we need to ensure that young people are included in the conversation and that they have a voice at the table.
Lele Balde, thanks so much for your time, much appreciated. Now, it's only the first day of the meetings, but reaction is already starting to come in on social media and from news organisations around the world. And many of them are picking up on the themes of Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva's curtain raiser speech. Now, the Financial Times says IMF chief issues gloomy assessment of global economy. The Guardian's headline, IMF chief warns world heading towards age of greater instability. Bloomberg Asia picked up on an example the managing director used in her speech. The global economy is at increasing risk of recession and could lose $4 trillion in output through 2026, a massive setback roughly equivalent to the size of Germany's economy. And Reuters wrote, World Bank's Malpass IMF Georgieva see risks rising of global recession. Now, that last article was co-written by Andrea Shalal, who's a regular watcher of the fund. She's one of more than 700 journalists who have registered to hear what the IMF can come up with to ease the world's economic woes. And she's here with me now. So it seems like a very sort of important moment. I think the economy is very high up on news agendas across the world. Is there pressure for something big and something substantive and possibly a solution to come out of this week's meetings?
Absolutely, Amanda. I think, all the eyes are going to be on these meetings this week with the risks rising of recession, with inflation still really eating up people's budgets, and with interest rates really hammering now, especially those countries in the emerging markets and developing countries. There's a lot of hope. A lot of NGOs and civil society organizations are looking for strong words on climate, on debt relief for those many countries that are really in trouble.
So it is an opportune moment, but these are massively complex challenges, aren't they, when you look at what is happening in Ukraine, an even worse situation today, which is obviously on top of COVID, on top of all of these problems that you mentioned. How realistic is it that that complexity can be kind of waded through and reach some kind of solution?
I think it really is a very tall order, and but I think we'll be looking for strong words from the G7. The G20 major economies will also be meeting. That will be very difficult because the Russians are part of that organization and will stay. Will be present, and so will be interesting to see what Western nations do in terms of that relationship when they're in the room together. The world is looking for clear answers, and there's a lot of pressure on these ministers and central bankers to do the right thing at the right time and at the right pace, because too much tightening is slowing the economy. Not enough will allow inflation to become rampant and to sort of take hold.
You mentioned being in the room. People are obviously back in person this time. How much has that changed the tone of the build-up?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, 10,000 people descend on this little corner of Washington for these meetings, and we haven't had that for a couple of years. And, you know, I think people have gotten very good at doing business and negotiating over Zoom, but it's true that in person things are a lot easier to get done because you can apply more pressure, I think. So we'll see. Hopefully the fact that everybody's here in person will make a difference.
Okay, Andrea Schlall, thank you very much for joining us. Now, of course, bringing together 190 countries is no mean feat. It's been months in the planning, weeks in the making. Earlier, I took a look at the now fully transformed atrium. So here we are. This is the main stage. It's been over a week in the making. Huge screen there, designed to connect as many people as possible and bring that sense of theatre to the event. The chairs are all lined up to host some of the biggest names in economics. The likes of Janet Yellen will be there, Kristalina Georgieva, giving their take on what is happening with the global economy and what kind of solutions we might see coming out of these annual meetings this week. Huge preparation going in this year, of course, because we are back in person. So it's been a massive logistical challenge. Fingers crossed everything goes according to plan. There are finishing touches going on now. And just over there in that corner is the IMF Today studio. Tomorrow kicks off the week's seminars series. One of them is on the social contract and how lessons can be learned from these challenging times to help families become more resilient against future shocks. Sarah Cumbers of Lloyd's Register Foundation will be a part of that panel. She's here now for a preview. So first of all, what is the social contract?
Social contract is all about that relationship between governments, between institutions and between people, between society.
And what role and what kind of message are you hoping to get through over the next few days?
So I'm here from Lloyd's Register Foundation. We're a global safety charity. We've got a mission to make the world safer, and we fund innovation, education and research programmes around the globe. And one of our major programmes is the World Risk Poll. And the World Risk Poll is really unique. Vanessa this morning talked about the need to listen to people's stories, and the World Risk Poll enables us to do that through data. So we funded Gallup to go into 121 countries in 2021 and ask a series of questions about risk and safety, including people's perceptions and their experience of resilience. And so we've got a fantastic data set that really gives us that ground level insight into people's experience of shock after shock and about how resilient they feel.
And we are here in person, but obviously the world is still recovering from a pandemic. How much of a role is that still playing?
The World Risk Poll was conducted in 2021. We have a baseline of the poll that was conducted in 2019. And so we were able to then measure the difference with some of the questions that we asked in 2019 and 2021. And actually we saw that there was very little difference, surprisingly small difference in response to some of the questions that we asked about risk and safety. And that really told us that actually people's response to COVID was very much grounded in their whole risk profile. So rather than thinking about COVID as a particular risk in their circumstances, it was all about where the next meal is coming from and whether they had a job and their financial security.
So you're going to be up there tomorrow. You're all slightly jet-lagged, perhaps, coming from the UK.
Yes.
What are you hoping? I mean, it's going to be a very different atmosphere in here. There'll be lots of people, obviously, very focused on what you're saying. What will you feel happy with coming away from tomorrow's panel?
For me, it's about the recognition that you can't take a one-size-fits-all approach to resilience. You have to take a granular approach and understand communities, understand individuals, and understand what you then can rely on in terms of their strengths, but also what has to be built. It's essential that we build in terms of resilience to support the communities that need it most.
And for this kind of gathering, you know, there are lots of policies, lots of meetings, but do you feel that having had that time off for a reason that no one wanted, a pandemic, do you feel that there will be kind of increased energy with everyone being back in the room?
Yeah. I mean, this is the first time that I've been to the IMF, but I was really quite surprised today, actually, at the appetite that there was for face-to-face again. People obviously hadn't seen each other for quite some time, and I think that does represent something different and something special, and I expect that the series will be even more impactful as a result.
Okay, Sarah Cumbers from Lloyd's Register Foundation, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, debt is a mounting burden for countries around the world. All eyes are on what the IMF can do this week to see what kind of role it can play in easing the pressure. It's going to be a big talking point throughout the week. Earlier today, I spoke to Sean Hagan of Georgetown University for his take. Sean Hagan, thank you so much for joining us on IMF Today. So debt, a big topic this week. Just tell me where we're at the moment when it comes to debt restructuring.
Well, I think the managing director in her curtain raiser speech really framed the issue, which is that a number of developing countries, both emerging market and low-income countries, are facing debt distress for reasons, many of which are beyond their control. Debt levels were already very high as a result of COVID, and their ability to service that debt has been really undermined by everything from rising interest rates, an appreciated dollar, and of course they're confronted with rising energy prices and rising food prices. So you put all that together, it's a perfect storm.
And what is the role of the IMF? What should the role of the IMF be in all of this?
So the IMF plays a central role, and it really provides an important public good when it comes to helping countries deal with debt distress. Countries come to the IMF when they've lost market access, when they can't find private debt that will enable them to refinance. And when that happens, the IMF basically is able to provide large amounts of financing, but the IMF has to make a decision. Is the program of adjustment going to be one that involves a debt restructuring or not? And that is a critical decision that the IMF makes. It's a public good that really has an influence on the process. If the IMF decides that the debt is unsustainable and a debt restructuring is necessary, then at that point, the IMF also really effectively determines how much debt relief is needed to achieve sustainability. And that defines the negotiations between the debtor and its creditors. So in some respects, the IMF plays a central role in deciding whether or not a debt restructuring is needed, but also in determining how much debt relief is needed.
Tell me about the common framework. How can it evolve?
So the common framework was I think a real breakthrough. It was an initiative of both the G20 and the Paris Club, designed to provide debt relief for low-income countries. Again, it relies on the fund because the IMF and the World Bank are at the center of the debt sustainability analysis, which determines how much debt relief is needed. One of the big challenges of the common framework is that it seeks to coordinate the activities of a very diverse set of official creditors. One of the evolutions of the international financial system is the emergence of creditors that had not typically been part of, for example, the Paris Club process, including countries like China. And one of the reasons why the common framework was a breakthrough was because China agreed to join it. Whether or not it's effectively implemented, however, will depend on a number of factors, including trust amongst those creditors, but also the robust application of IMF policies.
And as a former fund insider, now a fund watcher, what do you want to see come out of this week?
I think progress in the implementation of the common framework would be a great step. I think the fund as an institution, has enormous convening power. You know, one of the things that's so special about the fund is that it brings both political and intellectual legitimacy. The executive board, as the political body, brings that political legitimacy, but the staff brings the intellectual legitimacy. And when the two are working together effectively, it's a very powerful institution.
And we're here in person. Will that make a difference?
Absolutely. I'm a big believer in in-person meetings like this one.
Thank you, Sean Hagan.
Now, the annual meetings are the most significant gathering of global financial policymakers in the world. And finally, they are back in Washington, D.C. Looking around the halls today, you could really feel the energy that being in person brings. Seeing people in the flesh allows for that level of access, inclusion and connection that you just can't capture virtually. Now, the man behind the scenes bringing it all together is Seda Agada. He's the Secretary of the IMF. Seda, welcome. So it's your job to organise, to deliver, to bring these people together from almost every country in the world. Where do you start with that? How does it work?
Well, the first thing that it takes is listening to the membership. What is it that they want? So that's where we start off from. And what we have heard from them is that they want to come back together. They want to come back together in person to deliberate on the great economic challenges that we are facing. And what the membership has shown by what we have seen today, the great numbers that are here, is that they believe that the IMF and the World Bank have great convening power. It is a place where they can come and solve or try to address these great global challenges that we are facing. And then it takes the cooperation of all the different departments in the fund and working together with the IMF. We host a lot of other meetings here on the sides, as you know, the G20 meetings, the G7 meets during this time as well, the G24. So those big ministerial meetings such as the G20, a lot of decisions are made there. My job is to ensure with my team that the discussions that are being had there are consistent, they're parallel, we understand what each other are saying, and we're not talking at cross purposes. But more important perhaps than those big meetings are also the many bilateral and little meetings that take place where relationships are really built, where people talk honestly and frankly to each other and therefore build the basis for having agreement in those larger meetings.
Meetings in person. So what is the difference? Have you noticed any difference in the post-pandemic world?
I think that what we have seen is that, number one, there is an expectation in the post-pandemic world that even if you cannot attend meetings in person, you should be able to participate in them. So we are going to continue to leverage the technologies that we have so that where our delegations, for some reason or another, are not able to attend in person, even though we are going to try to move everybody to in person, but where for some reason somebody cannot attend in person, they would have the option to attend remotely. There are many people across the world who maybe are still a bit nervous about traveling in person at this time. They would be able to access remotely. So whether they be journalists, whether they be CSOs, whether they be students, we believe that we'll be able to leverage that technology that we have been using during the pandemic period to have a more inclusive meeting while still making the in-person aspect the most important part of it.
So full inclusion and participation, whatever the circumstances.
Exactly.
So Seda Agada, thank you so much for joining us on our first episode of IMF Today. And what a first day it was. And the next four are even more exciting. Tomorrow's events start with the much anticipated World Economic Outlook at 9 a.m., immediately followed by the Global Financial Stability Report. We also have two seminars tackling debt and social contract, a book launch on beneficial ownership transparency, and plenty of top-level ministerial meetings in between. Thanks for joining us for the first day of the meetings and IMF Today. Let's do it again tomorrow.